impact on the Sullivan Institute community. It took place in March of 1979. The leaders of the Sullivan Institute community were concerned that radioactive plumes with airborne contaminants would reach New York City. Approximately 150 people in the community left New York City at this time and traveled to Florida to avoid these contaminants. This was a pivotal moment in my life and in the life of the community. I realized that I wanted children and that I didn't want them to be affected by any mutations that the radioactivity might cause in my body. Seems strange now, but that is how we felt. Unfortunately for me, the TMI accident, our week-long exodus, and the hysteria that ensued made it impossible for me to focus on my graduate work. In addition, the demands on my time increased. All community members were expected to work to educate others about the dangers of nuclear power. This is when the group became explicitly political and formed the Fourth Wall Theater Company was formed right before that, but it became required for everyone to be a member and for everyone to do some kind of political outreach. After 7 years with TW, I decided that I needed a different type of experience with a therapist. I don't remember how I came to this conclusion, but it may have been spurred by TW's orders about the dissociating ourselves from that other group apartment or other things that she had done that were that were unpleasant, to say the least. I had a consultation with Saul Newton, which was the usual procedure if you wanted to change therapists, to have a consultation with one of the training analysts. And he referred me to his daughter, actually. I started seeing her. She was a member of the training. She was a trainee. She was in the training class at the Sullivan Institute. She was about 4 years older than I was. I started seeing her soon after without any formal termination that I can remember with TW. I felt liberated. SN was a different kind of therapist than TW. She listened to me and did not classify me in any particular way. She helped me to form views of people and situations in my life that enabled me to become more proactive. I felt that she respected me and was interested in what I had to say. During this time, I was a full-time graduate student at Columbia University in the geography department. I finished my master's in 1982, but was told that I could not gain admission to the doctoral program at Columbia. This was a gigantic blow for me. I became very depressed. After several months of licking my wounds, I applied to Rutgers University's Department of Geography and was accepted. I began a relationship with the person who later became my husband in 1980. Romantic relationships were frowned upon in the community because they were seen as a way of removing oneself from the group as a whole. They were also considered limiting of the individuals involved and potentially destructive. In spite of this, SN did not comment about my relationship with MC. My future husband, she was supportive and again listened to what I said about the relationship and how I felt. In 1982 or 83, I came to a session with SN, and she told me she was leaving New York to go to England. She could no longer be my therapist. I was sad about this, but on the other hand, I started to think that if she could leave, perhaps I could too. My relationship with MC had become stronger, and we were discussing some of the problems we had with the Sullivan Institute community. In the meantime, I was referred to AD, who at that time was living with the 4 leaders of the Sullivan Institute in a building on the Upper West Side. AD had recently given birth to twins, and she seemed a lot more interested in the twins than in her patients. They frequently came into her office during sessions with their babysitter, and I assume that AD considered this part of the therapeutic experience because she didn't stop the session or arrange to make up the time. By the time I became a patient of hers, I was already disaffected with the community. MC had ended our relationship, telling me that I was too focused on him. This was a common reason given for ending relationships in the community. I was devastated, was taking a few too many tranquilizers, and spoke with my therapist about it. Her suggestion was that I try to establish other relationships. I don't exactly remember how it came up, but I had told AD that I was interested in having children. I'd been doing some babysitting within the group for a while at this point. AD somehow communicated to me that she did not consider MC an acceptable father for my children, nor was she certain that I was mature enough to have children at all. I was devastated. And again, this was common. It was very common for therapists within this group to tell patients that they weren't ready to have children. Therapists also told patients they shouldn't be in careers that they were already in, or shouldn't aspire to become doctors, for example. We know people who were in medical programs who were told not to practice because they weren't human enough to practice. I continued to have contact with MC because I worked in his apartment as part of my community work assignment. Eventually, we started the relationship again. He told me that he had been ordered to stop seeing me by his therapist. MC was a trainee and was higher up in the hierarchy of the group than I was. He was in direct contact with the leadership and therefore knew more about their interference with the private lives of their patients. He told me a lot of things about the leadership that were horrifying to him and to me, and at this point we started to discuss leaving the group together. I began to lie in my sessions. I told AD that I wanted to redo my history in therapy. This meant that I wanted to revisit my infancy and childhood to determine their continuing impact on me as an adult. I did this so that I wouldn't have to discuss the present with her. At this point, we had concrete plans to leave the community, which we executed in March of 1985. I'm not sure how I terminated with AD. I think I did it via her answering machine. I moved out of my group apartment with one of my closest friends. We announced one day that we were leaving, and we brought packing boxes home and started to pack our things. Our roommates immediately reported this to the leadership, who told them to have us leave immediately, that is, without our possessions. We refused to do this because we wanted to pack our things first, and we had a mover coming the next morning. Our roommates hid from us in their rooms while we packed, and when it was time for us to leave, some were honestly sorry to see us go, while others accused us of being whores for MC, who had left 10 days earlier. It was violent and abrupt. My entire lifestyle changed that morning, and I couldn't speak with my former roommates because I was considered persona non grata. I have no memory of speaking with AD at this time. I may or may not have called her. She certainly did not call me. Okay, so the impact of the therapy. Clearly, the development of my personality and the course of my life were significantly impacted by these experiences, which took place over approximately 15 years of my early adolescence and young adulthood. I was 31 when I finally left the community. A few years later, I married MC, and 5 years later, we adopted a baby. In discussing the impact of the therapy, it's helpful to break it down into positive and negative impacts. I'm using these words in two senses. Positive to mean what the therapy focused on specifically in my life, and also to mean how it actively influenced me. I'm using the word negative to mean both the harm that was done to me and also the needs and problems I had that were not addressed. The development of my sexuality and my sense of myself as a sexual being was deeply affected by my experiences with Ralph Klein. His voyeuristic comments and attitude impacted me in the sense that I believe I acted in ways that I would not have otherwise. My early experimentation with sex may or may not have taken place without his input, but I don't think that my objectification of myself would have been the same. I was taught to distance my sexual feelings from my other emotions. Thankfully, I wasn't always able to achieve this separation, but at certain points in my life, I did have sexual encounters that were fairly impersonal. Getting too emotionally involved with one person was seen to be dangerous in the Sullivan Institute community. My sense of myself as a competent, intelligent person was both enhanced and assaulted at various points by my therapists and by the leadership of the community. I was supported in my academic aspirations, but at a certain point, the demands of the group made it impossible for me to achieve my goals. Additionally, one of the most basic things about my sense of self-worth as a woman, my ability to raise a child, was questioned. Simply having a great deal of social experiences in the context of the community helped my shyness and social anxiety. However, the deeper issues of my difficulties with friendship and commitment were never addressed. While I was a member of the group, I was able to develop close relationships with women and a few men. I don't remember being helped to deepen those relationships. Because my relationships with my father and mother were stopped during the period that I was in the group, I didn't have the opportunity to develop adult relationships with them. I didn't learn that I could separate from them, hold different opinions from them, and still love them. I was lucky to be able to resume these relationships after I left the group, but not without a lot of pain and loss. As has been made clear by the inclusion of the excerpts of Alice Graves' writing about her experiences with TW, I was not the only one to have been affected by her misuse of psychotherapeutic techniques and of the role that, if you can even call them that, I'm not sure they were psychotherapeutic techniques, and of the role that she played as an authority figure in my life. Nor was TW by any means the only trainee or non-trainee therapist that behaved in the ways that myself and Alice Graves have described. Over the past years, I've had many discussions with former patient members of the Sullivan Institute community. Many of them had similar experiences with their therapists, and some have been told that they were not fit to be parents and instructed to give up their children for adoption, and some did that. I believe that this is an act that should not be perpetrated against a parent. Of the many choices in our lives that we wish to make on our own, having a child is one of the most important, in my opinion. To tell a patient that they are not fit to be a parent and so they should not have children or should give up their already existing children, which they did also, is an action that a mental health practitioner needs to have overwhelming evidence of potential or actual harm to those children to take. Childbearing and child rearing was only one life decision that the Sullivan Institute psychotherapists felt empowered to direct their patients to make. Patients were often told to quit school or to go back to school in a different specialty because their therapists felt they would be better at another type of work. I talked about the doctors. The leaders of the group played God in the sense that they believed that they knew what was right for their patients better than the patients did. Acting on these beliefs is unethical, to say the very least. So while some patients benefited when their therapists agreed with them or supported them in life decisions, others were stymied and worse, prevented from exploring relationships, activities, and career paths that may have been ultimately fulfilling and productive. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Is this going to be okay? Sound all right? Yeah. So I'm going to do something I haven't done before as far as I know or can remember, which is I'm going to tell my cult story. In my 20s in New York, I was a struggling actor, and I struggled a great deal more than I acted. At one point, I was cast in a show, an exciting workshop with some well-known people involved where I got to sing and act and dance. And it was a show, of all things, about an Indian guru, about his spiritual journey and his teachings. It was like a Hindu god spell. It was all, to me, just some crazy cult nonsense, as far as I was concerned, and the show went nowhere along with my acting career. But a few years later, at the end of a long bout of despair, I learned that the guru we had sung and danced about in the show was in residence upstate at his ashram and that he was giving spiritual initiation. This was around 1981. I had by then sought help from two analytic therapists, candidates in training, I later understood. I left the one who was almost completely silent pretty quickly, and I stayed for a while with the second one. But when I succeeded in getting a romantic relationship off the ground, she decided therapy was over. So therapy ended. The girl soon broke up with me. I heard the guru was upstate, and I decided to go. Now, flash forward. That was 1981. When I began graduate school in social work in September of 1994, it had been just 2 years since I moved out of the spiritual community, the ashram, that I'd lived and worked in for more than 10 years, about 13, up until and a little bit after my 40th birthday. In the Hindu tradition, an ashram is a retreat compound that is the communal home of a guru, a teacher who's worshipped as a living saint, where followers come to pray, meditate, chant, and work together. My ex-guru, known as Guru Mai, maintained ashrams in India and upstate New York, as well as in other locations in the United States, and she toured extensively throughout the world. This guru's ashram in India is the one Elizabeth Gilbert wrote of in her bestseller, Eat, Pray, Love. At the height of Gurumai's popularity in the mid-'80s, thousands of visitors, swept up in the excitement of the New Age movement, flocked to weekend retreats at her ashrams all over the world to receive spiritual awakening. I worked for her for over a period of more than 10 years as a spokesperson, community manager, meditation teacher, public relations director, director of educational programs in the U.S. ashrams, and in extensive travels to the group's many international centers all around the globe. I'd been successful in strengthening and expanding the devotee communities I was sent to visit, organizational work for which I was praised by Gurumai. As a result, I was given more and more managerial responsibility in the last few years of my time in the ashram, and I became one of the relatively small group of followers who were granted extensive direct contact with her. One day, some small thing I casually said while speaking with Gurumai and some other staff members, I actually said a few words in defense of someone whom Gurumai was berating, suddenly changed everything. From then on, Gurumai began speaking to me with searing contempt and derision. After 6 months of being exposed to her relentless caustic denigration, face-to-face, in written notes, on the phone, and after almost daily episodes of public excoriation and humiliation, which included Gurumai enlisting others to join her in the attacks against me, Gurumai instructed me to leave the ashram and return to live and work in New York City. In accordance with the mercurial way that Gurumai typically behaved, I was still asked to do a good deal of work for the ashram, even after my expulsion. And for 2 more years, I remained in good favor with the Guru, even getting a cherished front row seat at public satsangs, programs in which Gurumai spoke to large audiences and accepted offerings, or in other words, in which she gave darshan. In the next 2 years after moving out of the ashram, scrambling to make a living, still thinking of myself as a follower of Gurumai, I did a good deal of soul searching, much of it through the process of psychotherapy. I was lucky enough not to select a therapist who was one that Gurumai worked with, because she directed many professional therapists to direct the therapy of the patients that she sent them. One of the uses I made of psychotherapy was to explore my career options, and my work in the ashram had been at my own expense until my funds ran out, after which I lived on a very small stipend. My parents had passed away. There was no family money. I was earning a living doing word processing as a temp in law firms. Inspired by what I was doing in therapy, I eventually chose to seek the necessary education and training to become a psychotherapist myself. In my first social work field placement, many of the clients I was assigned described terrible histories of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse in childhood, and in some cases were involved in ongoing abuse, either as perpetrators or victims. Many of these clients were struggling to recover from devastating addictions, and though my life had been something of a bed of roses in comparison with their suffering, not without trauma, but certainly not with the poverty and violence my social work clients reported, I soon discovered I had a deeper connection to their experiences of trauma and abuse than I had first realized. I'd always portrayed my participation in Siddha Yoga to myself and others as an idealistic commitment to a noble spiritual path, dedicated to spiritual awakening and uplift in the world. Just after grad school, I learned of an incident concerning a friend of mine from the ashram, a young woman just turned 21, who had been sexually harassed in the ashram by one of its most powerful male leaders, a man in his late 40s who was notoriously seductive and who years ago had pled no contest to statutory rape in the one instance when the parents of a teenage girl he had seduced took action against him. This man was protected and, in fact, was more or less a co-guru with Gurumai. When the young woman friend of mine sought help from Gurumai regarding what had happened between her and the male leader, Gurumai told her through her secretary that she had brought the harassment upon herself. Gurumai warned the young woman, "Don't ever tell anyone about this, especially not your mother." The young woman's mother, an influential leader of the Siddha Yoga community in a large U.S. city, was a longtime devotee of Gurumai's. After 2 years of intense inner conflict, this young woman finally did tell her story. As a result, many others began to speak out, eventually contributing to an extensive expose of City Yoga by Liz Harris in the New Yorker magazine. The article revealed a Pandora's box of well-documented abuses by the leaders of the group that had been going on for more than 20 years. I learned later that City Yoga followers were chosen by Guru Mai to become trained as Reiki practitioners, specifically for the purpose of doing long-distance Reiki 24 hours a day on Liz Harris and the New Yorker magazine in hopes of stopping the publication of the article. When that proved ineffective, followers around the world made a point of finding the magazine in libraries and tearing the article out. In the 2 years prior to the publication of the article that I'd spent living and working back in the city, I'd slowly and painfully begun to acknowledge to myself, my therapist, and my wife, herself a member at that time but no longer, that there were aspects of City Yoga and its leaders that I found unethical and disturbing. In particular, I'd personally experienced and also frequently witnessed Guru Mai verbally and emotionally abusing her followers, publicly shaming those with whom she was displeased in cruel and humiliating ways. I'd heard her tell blatant lies and witnessed her deliberately, maliciously deceiving others she wished to embarrass or harass, expressing pleasure in doing so. I witnessed her condoning and encouraging illegal and unethical business and labor practices, such as smuggling gold and U.S. dollars in and out of India, exploiting workers without providing adequate housing, food, health care, Social Security. I knew firsthand that she condoned, encouraged, and rewarded followers willing to stalk and harass her brother, whom she wanted out of the organization. I was aware that for many years, Guru Mai and her predecessor, Swami Muktananda, had been using spies, hidden cameras, and microphones to gather information about followers in the ashram, which was then used to embarrass them, often publicly. All of these behaviors were well known to those of us on the staff of the organization, but were much less familiar to the thousands of followers who didn't live and work there in direct contact with Guru Mai. The Eat, Pray, Love author Elizabeth Gilbert was one of the people who didn't, during her ashram visit, become aware of the sordid history of sexual abuse in City Yoga, or the emotional battering and financial exploitation suffered by those who worked more closely with Guru Mai. Staff members such as myself considered ourselves privileged to be exposed to the more private persona of Guru Mai, whose typical cruelty to her followers and whose expectation that no amount of money was too much to be spent on her was always understood as crazy wisdom, a term which refers to and celebrates the eccentric, mind-blowing, and paradoxical behaviors of spiritual leaders in various Eastern traditions. Aggression, greed, sexual predation, and other forms of cruelty are often among these behaviors in the stories of such leaders, who are understood to be, contrary to appearances, benignly breaking down the boundaries and defenses of followers, liberating them from their small, petty, unenlightened egos. Manny Gent made a very astute distinction between the word surrender and submission. He conceptualized surrender as a letting go of defenses and an opening to the possibility of the sublime, both as internal state and as interpersonal experience, whereas he understood submission as the dehumanizing, sadomasochistic perversion of surrender. Although I wasn't aware of Gent's work until sometime after leaving City Yoga, I was beginning to formulate similar ideas. I began to become aware that I had been deceived and had deceived myself in a classic bait and switch, the bait being surrender, the switch being masochistic submission to a cruel and controlling, idealized leader. Most shamefully of all the dissociating I'd been doing was that in order to continue to convince myself that I was making the best possible choice by devoting myself to City Yoga, I suppressed my awareness of stories of sexual abuse in the ashram, stories that would be absolutely heretical to even mention to another follower. I'd heard rumors that, contrary to his claims of celibacy and renunciation, the predecessor guru, Swami Muktananda, called Baba by his followers, had up until his death in his 70s been relentless in sexually preying upon female followers, many of them girls who were not of legal age. When some followers exposed him publicly, he had lied and attempted to cover up the scandal with threats of violence to the whistleblowers, threats made by Muktananda himself and by deputies he appointed and dispatched himself, one a former pro footballer and the other a former Vietnam combat vet. I deliberately chosen to disbelieve and deny this information, though a deeply buried part of me had kept mental notes on the many whispers and hints I'd heard. Later, after I severed all ties with Siddha Yoga in 1994, I came to learn of far more extensive sexual abuse of young girls, as well as adult women, several of whom I met and spoke with. Without knowing each other, the women reported exactly similar details. A secret room with a specially built table, which allowed Muktananda, then in his 70s, to stand while he raped them. I'll spare the reader the further details about this, but these are details each of these women reported without access to each other's accounts. Gurmai has continued to deny and cover up this aspect of her predecessor's behavior to this day. I also learned that many of the parents of the young girls whom Muktananda had molested had been proud that their daughters were chosen as though for a special divine ritual. I knew some of these people well before coming to live full-time in the ashram. One of those parents had been an Ivy League professor, another a prominent Jungian analyst. After Muktananda's death, Gurmai continued to defend the male leader who had abused the woman I knew, who was also abusing dozens of other young women, many of them minors. All my dissociated knowledge suddenly and dramatically broke fully into consciousness when I heard this young woman's story. I literally felt my body become enlivened and could physically feel my mind or my brain expanding and opening. In the phrase, "Don't ever tell anyone about this, especially not your mother," I heard a chilling echo of the voice of the incestuous father, the battering husband, the sexual harasser, the rapist. As Judith Herman says in her seminal War of Trauma and Recovery, quote, "Secrecy and silence are the perpetrator's first line of defense," unquote. It was hearing those words, "Don't ever tell," that broke for me what Ernst Becker has called the spell cast by persons, the nexus of unfreedom. I recognize in Gurmai's behavior toward her followers the hallmarks of abuse, the use of power to intimidate, seduce, coerce, belittle, humiliate others, not to strengthen, uplift, and enlighten as advertised, but for the more base purposes of psychological enslavement and parasitic exploitation. It should be noted that Siddha Yoga resembles in many ways a mainstream Hindu religion. In the United States and other major world capitals, it was successfully marketed to a population of well-educated, affluent professionals and included quite a few internationally known celebrities in business, the arts, and journalism. Once I'd spoken out publicly about Siddha Yoga in the early days of the internet, I was instantly, literally within hours, persona non grata in the community, so that the dozens of people I thought of as friends and the hundreds of others from all over the world that were friendly acquaintances immediately cut me off completely. Fortunately, there were enough members who left the community when I did for us to form a support group using the internet just as it was becoming popular. I also began to attend conferences organized by what is now the International Cultic Studies Association, where I have met hundreds of people over the years who identify either as having been in an abusive authoritarian group or who were concerned for loved ones in those groups. Since becoming licensed as a clinical social worker in 1996, and even before my analytic training, I've worked with dozens of cult-involved people, both in pro bono situations and in my private psychotherapy practice. Much of my interest and development of ideas about the relational system of the traumatizing narcissist stems from my interest in making sense of what for me and for thousands of others who've experienced abuse in cults was an enormously painful, life-altering experience that began in an ecstasy of hope and possibility and which ultimately became an abyss of cumulative relational trauma. My cousin's wife is a psychiatrist, and a few years after I left City Yoga, when I told her I was going into psychoanalytic training, she said, "Great, you've left one cult, now you're joining another." And that's not an uncommon observation. In Mitchell and Black's well-known book, there's a chapter heading Myth Number 4, Psychoanalysis is an esoteric cult requiring both conversion and years of study. Well, isn't it? That's when, well, no. Anyway, so I, but my own analytic experience up to that point was actually quite the opposite of my cult experience. Living a life focused on idolization, as I had done for so many years as a guru worshiper, I'd forgotten what it was like to experience myself as being worthy of kindness, encouragement, and empathy. Gurmai's modus operandi had been to follow up any expression of praise or approval with brutally intense disparagement and rejection. So those of us who dealt directly with her came to anticipate that the more kindness she offered, the more brutal it would be when the other shoe dropped. In therapy, the experience of my analysts being consistently empathetic with me and not suddenly switching to hostile attacks, and the experience of having my point of view and my subjectivity being respected and affirmed was something I'd almost forgotten was possible. It was also a great relief to experience that disruptions in relationships could be repaired, not through one of us submitting completely to the other, but through negotiation and mutual accountability. These experiences and my reading in the psychoanalytic literature convinced me there was potential in psychoanalytic work for deep understanding, healing, and growth. And these were the same goals that I and so many others like me thought would arise for myself and the world out of my dedication to City Yoga. But when it became clear that no such thing was going to be possible there, that idolization and self-negation, not self-realization, were the only real possibilities in that relationship, I was ready to start over. Better late than never. When I finally severed my ties with the cult, I could feel myself coming out of dissociation like the blood coming back into my veins. I tried so hard to murder my subjectivity and make myself the kind of object the guru would approve of and pay attention to. Initially, having experienced an indisputably ecstatic, mystical experience connected to the guru, I was at my most vulnerable. My pre-existing idealism and tendencies toward self-sacrifice moved right into idolatry, masochism, perversions of idealism and self-sacrifice, the opposite of what I now think of as spiritual. And what's been the most meaningful and enduring change and growth that I've known is the experience of finding, claiming, and knowing myself as subject, and working out the difference between feeling like a subject, like I'm me, or feeling like I have to be the right kind of object for someone, a guru, a spouse, a patient, a friend, colleague, in order to feel that I'm not alone. Searching for a way to feel that I had a self I could feel good about, I ended up drastically objectifying myself in the hopes of being certified as good by my ex-guru, in whom I invested all goodness. I've discovered that many others behave similarly with bosses, colleagues, parents, lovers, siblings. Many who enter psychotherapy know how depressed they are or anxious, but do not know the extent to which they've forsaken their subjectivity and submitted to objectification because they knew no other way to maintain a needed tie to an important other. I think I'll end it there. Thank you.
Can you hear me? That's good. No. Hello? Yeah. Hello. Okay. I'll go on the side like Amy did. Okay, so this afternoon I'm going to present on the best practices in trauma treatment and speak about therapy issues for this particular issue, for people coming out of groups, whether they've been born and raised or joined as adults and left as adults. And I've been seeing former members and sometimes current members and their families since 1984. We've all been around a long time doing this. Practices have changed over the years, and as trauma therapy and practice have now led from my understanding of trauma processing techniques. So I'm going to talk about that, something that I've only been doing the past 7 or 8 years, to hasten the healing of PTSD. Hasten? Hasten, yeah, that's what I thought. It's better than circumcision. Particularly, I'm talking about dissociation and triggers for nervous system activation. So I've given you a handout on nervous system activation. I just want to explain what that is, because I talked about it a little bit at the beginning. So this is what is termed a healthy nervous system. I like to think of it as a wholesome nervous system, because I'm not big on healthy and unhealthy, pathological and not pathological. So this is the wholesome nervous system. So think of it this way. Here you are on your way to work in the subway in Brooklyn, and you're feeling pretty good, but then the subway gets stopped. The train gets stopped. And you begin to get tense because you realize you were running a little late this morning and you're probably going to be late for work. So your heart starts to race, you can't think straight, you're getting a little upset, and you're up here in terms of your activation, sort of like agitated. But then you see someone you know, and you smile, and they smile at you, and you begin to settle into what's called parasympathetic, kind of a relaxed state in the moment, making contact with someone who you care about, who just smiled at you. But then you remember that you came in a little late yesterday, and that the train still isn't moving, and so you're up here, and then you remember you're usually on time, so what, you're late 2 days in a row, it comes down. So this is sort of like a little bit of stress and a little bit of recovery. And in this range, a person can think straight. That's really important in terms of what happens with trauma. You can think, you're curious, you can problem solve, even when you're a little bit upset, right? You can be thinking about how to manage the problem. Can everyone? Oh, everyone has one. Okay. But when people are traumatized, let's say Michael frozen in the doorway, and he's kind of frozen, and he's not metabolizing or using the energy the way Peter did, you can get what's called stuck on. And stuck on means almost chronically anxious, panicky, hyperactive, having an exaggerated startle reaction, restlessness, hypervigilance, usually digestive problems, and on and on and on. And this is what we call angry people. Sometimes they have what we call a stuck fight response, angry. And this is stuck on off, which is like depressed. If you're stuck on for too long, the body just says, no, I'm exhausted. So oftentimes when people have been in a group for a long time and they're agitated and frightened that they're going to be berated or something terrible is going to happen, they end up down here, really flat for long periods of time, and disoriented. So I'm going to refer to those experiences as I go through this part of the talk. So this is phase-oriented therapy with former members, best practices. The trauma from cult involvement is about loss, dissociation, boundary ruptures, and betrayal. Healing impacts growth and connection, integration, self-recovery, self-respect, and trust. Healing is also about learning to live in a world of ambiguity in multiple relationships, including group involvement. It involves understanding layers of cultural identity and the sense of otherness that comes with a stigmatized experience. The most comprehensive approach to these issues is the standard of care in the trauma field, the phase-oriented model, which I like, that was put forth in Ford and Catois' book, Treating Complex Traumatic Stress Disorders. Again, complex stress is prolonged captivity, like prolonged child abuse in a family or being in a cult. For those who are new to trauma therapy, this is an excellent book with a variety of approaches and options for practice, and it puts forth the best practices in the field.